Hi everyone, we're back again now with the Gaming America's quarterly meetup. It's the Q3 meetup, and today is going to be divided into two sections. First, now we have the Gaming Insights with SEGEV LLP, presented by Negin Alavi, and we will take a 1 hour break, and later we'll be back with the next two sessions, which were the Q3 updates of the legislation in the US, and an AI-related session. So, Negin, I would like to invite you on screen, and yeah, you can just go ahead and get started with your session.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much, Zoltan, as always. It's such a pleasure to be here to do this talk. I love talking about the law. Yeah, my name is Negin Alavi. I'm a lawyer at SEGEV LLP. Our main office is located in Vancouver, Canada. We also have offices in Toronto, the United States, and China. We are a full-service business law firm, meaning that we do just about everything. But one of our specialties is gambling law. That's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the gaming and betting legal landscape in Canada, and also touch on notable recent legal reforms to Canadian gaming and betting laws. Then after that, I'm going to talk about the incredibly significant changes proposed in Bill S268, which is titled An Act to Amend the Criminal Code and the Indian Act. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm giving this presentation from Vancouver, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This means that Vancouver is located on territory that was never ceded or given up to the Crown by the Musqueam, Squamish, or Tsleil-Waututh peoples. The purpose of that land acknowledgement is twofold. First, it obviously pays respects to the Indigenous peoples that are stewards of these lands, and it also changes the nature of conversations that are had about Canadian law, especially Canadian laws about Indigenous peoples. And as I will describe, if Bill S268 becomes law, the Canadian gaming landscape will be changed dramatically, and Indigenous peoples in Canada will also see significant changes. But first, I'd like to talk about the current legal landscape in Canada. And you can't talk about it without talking about the criminal code. The criminal code is the main piece of legislation that deals with gaming and betting in Canada. It is federal legislation, and that means only the federal government can change it. Provincial governments can't. Currently, the Criminal Code of Canada makes gaming and betting completely illegal, subject to exceptions. The gaming activity, if it's conducted and managed by a provincial government, that's the main exception. What does conduct and manage mean? Well, there's case law around this. For the purposes of this presentation, I won't go into the nuance. It basically means that conduct and manage is being the operating mind of the gaming activity. So that means it can't be hands-off licensing. There's no outright hands-off licensing for-profit gaming operators in Canada. It needs provincial conduct and management. In order to stay on side of the criminal code provisions outlawing gaming generally, the provinces have to be the operating mind, and that includes lottery schemes. They're one type of gaming activity, but as we know, there's a variety. Gambling under the criminal code has three basic elements in order for it to be considered gambling: consideration, which is the bet or wager of money and money's worth; chance; and prize. In Canada, mixed skill and chance is still considered chance. And so if you have a game that's mixed skill and chance with consideration and prize, it's still gambling. I know that in other jurisdictions, mixed skill and chance might have a different meaning, but in Canada, it's still gambling. And so any gaming in Canada must currently therefore be conducted and managed by provincial governments, even on reservation lands. First Nations currently cannot offer gaming products like lotteries without being conducted and managed by a province, because it has to fit into an exception in the criminal code. The provinces do have jurisdiction to pass gaming legislation to govern gaming within that province. For example, the British Columbia Gaming Control Act and regulations. However, that doesn't mean that they don't have to conduct and manage all gaming activities offered. They have to take that role even in partnerships with offshore gaming operators, such as those in Ontario's new iGaming regime. The provinces can't unilaterally amend the Criminal Code of Canada to change who can conduct and manage gaming in Canada because it's federal legislation, and the provinces can only change provincial legislation. That being said, there have been two very big recent legal reforms for Canadian iGaming that have legalized, first of all, single event sports betting, which happened in August 27th, 2021, and also Ontario's launch of the now established regulated iGaming regime on April 4th, 2022. So these have already been enacted. I'm sure many of us are familiar, especially with Ontario's new iGaming regime. Before Canada legalized single event sports betting, the provinces were legally only allowed to offer parlay betting. Parlay betting being a bet on the outcome of more than one event at a time. As most of us know, most bettors prefer to bet on single events, the thing that's happening in front of us, the exciting game that we're about to experience. And that restriction previously imposed by federal legislation had cut provinces out of serving this large single betting preferring market demand. The vacuum was filled with offshore operators, and as that action went offshore, so did provincial revenue. Now that Canada has come up to speed and legalized single event sports betting, any province can conduct and manage single event sports betting offers, which is incredible. With this change in place, Ontario was much better positioned to launch its iGaming regime. With a market this size, the legacy parlay betting requirement would have been missing a huge opportunity. Now that the province can offer single event sports betting, Ontario's iGaming regime is truly competitive with unregulated gray industry. It allows for registered iGaming operators to legally offer catalogs that many consumers in Ontario already have come to know and enjoy. There's been a lot of excitement around the newly operated Ontario iGaming market, and for good reason. Residents of Ontario alone spend almost $1 billion a year on online gambling. It makes perfect sense to register private operators rather than compete with them. And this last point should not be glanced over. The gray market operators want to register in Canada. They want to follow the rules. Since inception of iGaming in the late 1990s, Canadian companies have been in the forefront of the industry. We're very proud of this. Unfortunately, the Canadian legal regime did not develop along with the industry in Canada at that time. Many of our best companies and industry professionals, as a result, moved offshore and developed other cities, other jurisdictions into iGaming hubs. Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, which are historically and currently host cities to some of the greatest iGaming companies and talent. And I'm not even being biased by saying that. We could have realized the same. Hopefully now we can see Canada achieve its true potential. And the Ontario government reaps substantial tax revenues compared to before that were previously lost to unregulated gaming and betting operators that they can now have partnership with. So now that those legislative reforms have come into effect, the iGaming industry in Canada is much more likely to see better regulations that allow for consumer protection, responsible gaming, reduction of gambling-related harm, more taxable income that grows the Canadian economy, and potential job creation for emerging Canadian iGaming companies or foreign iGaming companies that want to do business in Canada. So that's where we are right now. We have the criminal code, we have provincial conduct and management, and those are the notable gaming and betting laws currently in effect. But what about new ones coming down the pipe? Well, the biggest is Bill S-268, which I'm going to talk about now. Bill 268 proposes to end the provincial government's effective monopoly on the conduct and management of lotteries in Canada. This is an enormous change. In short, the bill seeks to provide the governing body of a First Nation with exclusive authority to conduct and manage lottery schemes on its reserve and license the conduct and management of a lottery scheme by other persons and entities on its reserve. To do this, the bill seeks to amend the criminal code, which makes sense, and also the Indian Act, which I will explain. I should emphasize that this bill is not yet law. The bill completed its first reading on June 20th, 2023, and there's been no activity on second reading, which means it's not guaranteed to be law, but there is a good chance it will, and I recommend that everyone follow this if they are following gaming and betting laws in Canada. But first, some background on those that may not be familiar with the legal distinction between Indigenous peoples and First Nations. Indigenous peoples is a term for all the original peoples of Canada and their descendants. So any person who falls in that category, it's appropriate to call Indigenous peoples in this legal distinction. A First Nation is a group of Indigenous peoples that the Canadian federal government officially recognizes as an administrative unit under legislation called the Indian Act, which is one of the pieces of legislation that the bill proposes to amend, or the functions as such without official status. And so the term excludes Inuit and Métis people. In the bill, First Nation is defined as a band of an Indigenous group that is a party to a self-government agreement implemented by an act of Parliament. And so although the bill recognizes inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples, the bill proposes providing the governing body of a First Nation the exclusive authority I've just described. So what is the Indian Act? Why does the Indian Act need to be amended for this proposed change in Canadian gaming law to take effect? Well, the Indian Act is not normally thought of as gaming legislation. It was enacted in 1876 and continues to be Canadian legislation that affects First Nations communities. Originally, it has a very dark history. It attempted to force assimilation of Indigenous peoples and had numerous discriminatory provisions in it. Now, many of those discriminatory provisions have been removed from the Indian Act, but the Indian Act still continues to govern all matters related to status, bans, and reserves, and therefore still affects the lives of Indigenous peoples today. In order to make laws that affect the lives of First Nations on reserve, the Indian Act therefore has to be amended too, not just the criminal code, even though the criminal code is the main piece of federal legislation that deals with gambling in Canada. So now I'm going to discuss the actual contents of Bill S268, starting with the preamble. Preambles aren't normally enforceable laws. Normally you have a preamble and then you have the enforceable part of a law, but preambles are still important and I would not ignore them. The bill's preamble in this case is particularly important because it outlines the legal basis for the proposed changes, and I'm going to read it because it is so incredible. Whereas Parliament recognizes the inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples, including their rights to their lands, to self-determination, and of self-government. Whereas those inherent and treaty rights encompass the rights of Indigenous peoples to regulate activities such as gaming, betting, and lotteries on their lands. Whereas the Government of Canada is committed to implementing the First Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which emphasizes the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples of the world. And whereas the protection of Aboriginal and treaty rights, recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982, is an underlying principle and value of the Constitution of Canada. This means that the bill isn't suggesting that Canadian lawmakers give Indigenous peoples new rights. It suggests Indigenous peoples already have the inherent and treaty rights to regulate activities such as gaming and betting and lotteries on their lands. It remains to be seen what further impact this wording would have on Canada's legal frameworks should Bill S268 become law. The bill speaks to inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, but what does that mean legally? What does inherent rights mean legally? The truth is that Canadian law recognizing inherent rights of Indigenous people is evolving to this day, as is apparent with the bill. People are not entirely sure whether or not, for example, Section 35 of the Constitution Act is like an open, empty box. Is it a filled box? Are there already rights? But here are some things I know for sure. Indigenous peoples have lived in Canada since time immemorial. Indigenous peoples developed laws and systems of governance long before colonization, long before the Crown came to Canada, long before newcomers came to Canada for that contact. Indigenous laws and governance have continued to exist and continue to be revived to the present day. We can't ignore those facts when we're thinking about inherent rights. Now that we're thinking about that, I'm going to go through the enforceable part of the bill, which are the proposed Criminal Code and Indian Act amendments. The proposed amendments, as I've already described, but going through it, the proposed amendments allow for a governing body of a First Nation, either alone or in junction with the governing body of another First Nation, or other such person or authority as may be specified, to conduct and manage a lottery scheme on that First Nations reserve, or on that First Nations reserve and the other First Nations reserve, in accordance by any law or bylaw enacted by the governing body of that First Nation. And so this gives First Nations flexibility in shaping how the lotteries on reserves will be conducted and managed. The amendments also cover things like charitable gaming licenses, fairs and exhibition gaming, amusement park lotteries, and terms and conditions of licenses. This significantly mirrors what is currently existing in the criminal code exceptions today. That mirroring is huge. It would be the first time in modern Canadian gaming law where provincial governments do not need to be involved in for-profit gaming other than being given notice. And although the bill states that its proposal is based on existing inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples, it does still require that notice. It requires First Nations provide notice of their intention to exercise those rights before exercising them. The bill doesn't give explanation as to why First Nations should need to provide Canadian provincial governments prior notice, but that notice provision is still present. Even with that, it changes the regulatory and legal landscape of Canadian gaming completely. Just imagine where we are right now. So instead of there being a very small relative number of provincial governments that conduct and manage gaming and betting, there's an enormous increase of government bodies that conduct and manage gaming and betting in Canada. That means that if Bill S268 becomes laws, perhaps hundreds of First Nations can conduct and manage lotteries on their lands, in accordance with their own laws or bylaws enacted by the governing body of that First Nation. It would change it completely. The number of conducting management lotteries, each with their own schemes, incredible. It opens up the possibilities of not just tremendous revenue and financial gains for First Nations, but it's also incredibly empowering for Indigenous peoples when the Canadian government acknowledges Indigenous rights to make decisions about gaming on their own lands. Remember, they're First Nations, each a nation. No First Nation would be forced to conduct and manage a lottery, so it could be that the number ends up not being as high as it could be, but that's a choice that First Nations would make. That's a choice that they could make, and some would argue should always have been able to make. But regardless, this bill is seeking to cement that and have everyone be on the same page about those inherent and treaty rights. The Canadian government has an ongoing responsibility to further reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. It takes a quick Google search to read the horrendous past that Canadians have to live with. Recognizing inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples is central to this. It's not just about where we have been, it's what we're doing today. Every industry in Canada, including the gaming industry, has to prepare for an increase in proposed laws such as Bill 268. We have to be alive to the possibility that gaming laws as we see it, other kinds of laws as we see it, might not be the same moving forward. Gaming laws seems to have had so many legislative reforms, and it's more to come. There's definitely more to come. And if Bill S268 becomes law, it seems natural that other types of gaming rights follow this authority to conduct and manage lotteries. What other types of gaming could there be? Potentially any types of gaming. What remains to be seen in the future is whether or not, first of all, whether or not that bill becomes law, whether or not other types of bills become law that have similar effects. And what that means for example, offshore operators who want to be registered in Canada, want to do business in Canada, how that revenue can affect and impact Indigenous peoples, Canadians in general, is remains to be seen. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening. Zoltan, are there any questions from the audience?
No, not yet. Just some cheers on the YouTube live stream about the great insights you're sharing. So I did not know that such laws are to be considered in Canada right now. And I was just, in the meantime, I was just publishing an article about a recent fine that was given by the Alcohol and Gaming Commission.
Oh yes.
Yeah, we just received the press release. So yeah, there's an interesting things coming to Canada, and probably
Mhm.
lots of things to talk about in I guess Q1 of 2024, because
Yes.
that's most probably when it's going to make its effect. All right,
Yeah.
so Nagin, thank you so much. We
Thank
we
you.
look forward to your next presentation in November. And for the viewers who we already have like 160 viewers on YouTube, stick around. We'll have 1 hour break, and then we will come back with the next session. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.